All right, let's dive right into this explainer on Unit 3 of the Indian economy. If you're an MA Economics student gearing up for exams, you are absolutely in the right place. Today, we're taking all those complex theories about poverty and transforming them into one clear, connected narrative. We're not just memorizing isolated questions here, we're building a comprehensive story of poverty in India. We'll be walking through how we actually diagnose the problem, all the way to how we can move past just giving out temporary relief and instead ensure a truly durable cure. So, here is our agenda for this diagnosis to cure approach. First, understanding and identifying poverty. Second, constructing lines and measures. Third, the unemployment trap. Fourth, growth versus poverty reduction. And finally, the multidimensional poverty index. Let's get started. Section 1. Understanding and identifying poverty. Okay, we have to start by recognizing a fundamental truth. Poverty isn't just about having a low balance in your bank account. It's a severe deprivation of basic capabilities, health, education, and social participation. To really get this, we need to look at poverty's dual nature. Amartya Sen makes this fantastic argument that poverty contains both an absolute core and a relative element. Absolute poverty is exactly what it sounds like, lacking the bare minimum for survival, like food, water, and shelter. But relative poverty, that recognizes that the minimum required for a quote-unquote dignified life actually shifts depending on the society you're living in. What's considered a basic necessity in one era or one country might completely be a luxury in another. And that leads us straight into Amartya Sen's capability approach. This is absolutely vital for your exams. Sen argues that we shouldn't just measure poverty by what people possess, like their income, but by what they're actually able to do and become. Scholar Lin Yang really builds on this, pointing out that even if someone manages to cross a specific income line, they might still be suffering from intense material deprivation and social exclusion. If they don't have access to clean sanitation, decent education, or secure work, well, money alone just paints a really incomplete picture. Now, Amartya Sen also makes this brilliant distinction between two totally different exercises: identification and measurement. Identification simply asks, who is poor? And this is basically where we draw a poverty line. Measurement, on the other hand, asks, how bad is it? Imagine two different states, both with 20% of their population living below the poverty line. The headcount ratio is identical, right? But in one state, those folks might be just a few rupees below the line. In the other, they could be facing outright starvation. So we have to identify first, and only then can we measure the actual depth of the problem. Which brings us right to Section 2, constructing lines and measures. Actually building these diagnostic tools is never a completely neutral or mechanical process. Constructing a poverty line in India means juggling a lot of highly debated variables. Historically, India relied on calorie norms, specifically 2,400 calories a day for rural areas and 2,100 for urban areas to set that baseline. But obviously, poor households need more than just calories. They need healthcare, rent, and fuel. So policymakers are constantly having to adjust for shifting consumption patterns, balancing food versus non-food expenditures, factoring in rural-urban price differences, and dealing with inflation. Plus, they have to account for intra-household inequality. Because think about it, an average household income can easily hide deprived women or children living within that very home. Add massive data challenges and survey errors to the mix, and you've got quite the puzzle. The big takeaway here is that while we absolutely need poverty lines for targeted policy, they aren't perfect, objective truths. Just look at the historical debates between the Lakdawala, Tendulkar, and Rangarajan expert committees. Their differing approaches prove that tweaking the consumption basket or updating the price index can drastically alter the official poverty rate. It's a very complex, ongoing economic debate. Once we've drawn that line, we have to measure the poverty accurately. If a government relies solely on the headcount ratio, they only know how many people are poor. A tiny cash transfer could nudge people just barely over the line, making the headcount drop, which looks like a massive success on paper. But that completely masks the continuing hardship of the people stuck at the very bottom. That's exactly why we need the poverty gap, which shows us how far below the line people actually fall, and the squared poverty gap, which mathematically gives extra weight to the poorest of the poor, capturing the true severity of their situation. You'll definitely want to lock this recall formula into your memory for the exam. Line, count, gap, severity. First, you set the line to identify the poor. Then, you count the head count. Next, you assess the gap to understand the depth. And finally, you square it to measure the severity. Moving on to Section 3, the unemployment trap. Now that we know how to measure poverty, we have to look at its biggest comorbidity. You'll often hear people say poverty and unemployment are two sides of the same coin. But are they? While it's largely correct in spirit, it's not literally true. A person could be fully employed, working exhausting 12-hour days, and still be completely trapped in poverty because of incredibly low wages. It really is a vicious cycle. First, a lack of regular employment drastically cuts down a household's income. This sudden poverty immediately chokes off the family's access to quality education, healthcare, transportation, and credit. And because they're stripped of those basic capabilities and social networks, they are then locked out of securing good jobs in the future. Lack of jobs creates poverty, and poverty prevents future employment. But the situation in India has a very specific flavor. The India Employment Report 2024 highlights that our real underlying issue is hidden unemployment. Millions of people simply can't afford to just sit at home. They have to work to survive. So we see a ton of disguised unemployment in agriculture, seasonal labor, underemployment, unpaid family work, and millions doing low-paid self-employment in the informal sector. These are the working poor. On top of that, educated youth and women face massive structural barriers just trying to enter the formal workforce. So the solution isn't necessarily just more work, it's more productive and better paid work. All right, Section 4, Growth versus Poverty Reduction. We know unemployment causes poverty, but does macroeconomic growth automatically fix it? To figure that out, we look at the proximate causes of economic growth. The usual suspects are capital formation, boosting human capital through education and skills, introducing new technology, and structural transformation, like shifting workers from agriculture to services. These definitely drive GDP up. But when we look at poverty, we have to ask a much more important question. Who is actually receiving the benefits of this growth? The economist Sudipto Mundal hits the nail on the head when he asks, growth of what? He argues that an employment-centered development strategy is way more critical than just cheering for raw GDP numbers. If our GDP is growing simply because a few highly capital-intensive tech companies are making billions, while manufacturing and agriculture stagnate, well, the poor are left entirely behind. This exact idea is formalized in the Poverty Equivalent Growth Rate, or PEGR, developed by Kakwani, Kontger, and Son. This concept beautifully illustrates that high GDP growth has a much weaker poverty-reducing effect if the poor are only getting a tiny slice of the pie. It means we have to evaluate growth alongside distribution. Growth is necessary, absolutely, but without equal distribution, it's never sufficient on its own. To add to this, Martin Ravallian warns us that the growth elasticity of poverty, which basically means how much poverty drops for every 1% increase in GDP, is not some fixed, magical mathematical rule. It constantly changes across different places and time periods because things like underlying inequality, data quality, and even how we define poverty keep shifting. Dat in Ravallian's evidence from India proves that the specific sectoral and rural-urban patterns of growth matter immensely. At the end of the day, decent employment is the only reliable bridge connecting raw macroeconomic growth to real poverty reduction at the household level. Let's move to our final section, Section 5, the Multidimensional Poverty Index. Because income growth doesn't tell the whole story, we need a better diagnostic tool. Enter the Multidimensional Poverty Index, or MPI. The Oxford Poverty and Human Development Initiative, OPHI, along with the UNDP, use what's called the Alkire-Foster counting method. It works a bit like a recipe. You start with a household survey. You choose your dimensions and indicators. You assign mathematical weights to them. Then you calculate a deprivation score for each household. If that score hits 1/3 or higher, that household is officially classified as multidimensionally poor. So what exactly are they measuring? The global MPI looks at 3 key dimensions: health, education, and standard of living. Each gets an equal weight of 1/3. It acts as a fantastic complement to income poverty. Instead of just checking a bank balance, it visually maps out real-world deprivations. It looks at indicators like nutrition and child mortality for health. It checks years of schooling and attendance for education, and it measures everyday standard of living through access to safe cooking fuel, sanitation, drinking water, electricity, housing, and basic assets. Now, let's talk math. The MPI is calculated by multiplying the headcount ratio, the incidence of poverty, by the intensity of that poverty. So MPI equals H times A. This is a game changer because it lets policymakers see the exact overlapping disadvantages that are holding people down. A state could theoretically have low income poverty, but shockingly high multidimensional poverty if their public health and sanitation infrastructure is falling apart. And this brings us to our final overarching question. How do we actually cure it? How do we move beyond temporary relief to ensure a durable, permanent exit from poverty for the next generation? As you synthesize all of this for your exams, keep in mind that isolated, temporary cash relief schemes are just not enough. A durable exit requires building productive capacities, enforcing minimum wages, and committing to an employment-rich development strategy. Leave yourself with this thought. If we only treat the symptoms of poverty today without actively building the capabilities of the poor for tomorrow, are we truly eradicating poverty, or are we just managing it? Good luck with your revision.